In fact, if you haven't been to Eastern Europe, I have to say one of the most signal experiences I had in this job was meeting people in places like Estonia, Latvia, the Czech Republic, and hearing from their own lips how much they still savor the taste of freedom that they received when the Soviet Union pulled out of Eastern Europe at the end of the Cold War, and how very real that is to them as something that they cherish. And Ralph mentioned the issue of complacency. For those who have a tendency to get complacent about the state of the world, or who treat the absence of a threat last week or 2 weeks ago as a cause for abandoning concern about the dangers of the world, I suggest you talk to people who've lived with that danger for a long period of time, and you realize that the memory of the new taste of freedom is not one they've grown complacent with. It's one they continue to cherish and to value and to be willing to defend. And I think it's a great moment with the onset of the visa waiver program to remind ourselves of how deep our bond of freedom and friendship is with those freedom-loving people across the Atlantic. Now, the second thing I talked about today was our Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. That touches closer to home, and again, it's the same challenge that we face. We have a long border with Canada, a long border with Mexico. We have a lot of trade and travel. But we also live in a world after 9/11, whereas the 9/11 Commission reminded us a false document in the hands of a terrorist is a weapon. And therefore, we have to have a greater ability to control who comes into the United States, to be confident that they're the people that we want to admit to the U.S., and to be sure that we know who they are, that we can authenticate and validate their identity and their authority to come as visitors or as business travelers. And so, since the 9/11 Commission report came out, and since Congress began to implement some of the elements of that report, we've moved forward on a process that we call the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. And it's designed to move from the system that we had up until early this year, where you could cross the border, let's say, with Canada, if you were an American or Canadian, simply by showing a library card or showing your college ID, or in some cases simply by saying, oh, I'm an American citizen, and be waved through. We're moving from that system to what, as of next June, will be a system that requires a secure form of documentation, like a passport or a pass card, or what they call a Nexus Trusted Traveler card, or some driver's licenses which have certain enhanced features. And you'll have to show that kind of a document to come into the United States. Now, the security benefits of this kind of document are obvious. What it does is it gives us confidence that the person who presents themselves at the border is who they say they are. And they are, in fact, an American or a Canadian, as opposed to being someone from a country that requires a passport or requires a visa. It tells us that the person presented is who they say they are, so we know they're not on a watch list, so we don't repeat the mistake prior to 9/11 of having people come into the United States to carry out a terrorist attack who were watch listed or held in databases as potential terrorists. And at the same time that it gives us this enhanced security, it does something else. It increases our efficiency. Because under the current system, if you're being diligent at the border, you have to manually type in the name of the person who's coming in to see if they're on a watch list or to make sure that there's no reason to deny them admissibility. But with the technology on the card, a machine automatically scans or reads the documentation on the card based on a chip or a machine-readable zone, and then automatically the information necessary comes up. And that saves everybody time at the gate and everybody time at the border inspection station, and that speeds the lineup. So that's a great opportunity to, again, satisfy the dual needs of security and efficiency in order to make sure that we can protect ourselves, but also make it more convenient for people to come into this country in order to enjoy the very benefits that we have, and that, frankly, for us to enjoy the economic benefits of travel and trade into the United States of America. But if we stand back, the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, the Visa Waiver Program, are simply emblematic of a larger set of issues that we face in the 21st century. And I think they're emblematic of the fact that we can address these issues by finding ways to satisfy both security and privacy, and by finding ways to serve both the need to protect ourselves and the need to be more efficient. In fact, it's my argument that many of the criticisms that are directed at some of the security measures we take, based on the theory that we're somehow violating privacy, actually have it exactly backward. That the measures we're taking protect privacy, they enhance privacy, and therefore they actually promote individual civil rights as opposed to somehow impinging upon them. And I think that the crystal clear example of that is on the issue of identity management. How we verify identity. This comes up in a whole host of areas in the work that I do. As I said, it comes across in terms of our requirement for identification to get into the United States, in terms of having a passport or a pass card. It comes up in terms of some of the identification that we're requiring for port workers now, our transportation workers identification card. It comes up in the requirement for secure identification to get on airplanes or to get in federal buildings. In each of these cases, we're talking about building the capability to do two things. First of all, to determine whether a particular person is who they say they are and entitled to the rights and privileges that go along with their identity. For example, if you're a U.S. citizen, you have a right to vote, you have a right to sit on a jury, you have a right to work in the country. So it's important in a lot of settings for us to know whether the person who presents himself or herself is a U.S. citizen. We don't want to have non-citizens sitting on juries or voting, so the ability to identify that person becomes important in protecting those values. And then once you've validated a person, there becomes the question, how does that person authenticate their identity in the myriad ways that we have to identify ourselves in the course of our daily lives? When you get asked by a police officer who stops you for a driving infraction, how do you authenticate your identity? When you're asked about going to a building, about in terms of whether you are who you say you are, how do you authenticate that? And that comes down to the issue of whether you have a secure document or some kind of secure way of proving and authenticating that the name you're representing yourself to hold is in fact your real name. I will say to you that identity, of course, is important not just in terms of security, but it really runs across the entirety of our lives in the 21st century. In fact, it's my contention that your ability to control your identity, to protect your identity, and also to ask other people to identify themselves. This is maybe the most important asset and most important transactional feature of the 21st century. And it comes up in a whole host of ways. Some of them I've already addressed. I don't think there's much doubt about the fact that it's perfectly appropriate to find out who a person is before we admit them into the country to cross a border. In much the same way that you wouldn't allow a person to come into your house to read the gas meter or to perform a repair without seeing their credentials and making sure that they're, in fact, a repairman rather than a robber. Second, increasingly, as the country turns to the question of employment and who's entitled to be employed in this country and who's not entitled to be employed, who's legally present, who's not legally present, the ability for an employer to verify identity and for an employee to establish identity becomes a critical feature of the ability to work and also to move from one job to another job. Even apart from these mainly governmental functions, identity is important in protecting our physical assets, business transactions, conducted over the internet, conducted in person, buying, selling, cashing a check, signing a contract. Increasingly, people want to be assured that when, in fact, you're representing yourself to have certain assets or to be the appropriate signer for a bank account, that you are, in fact, that person. And therefore, the flip side is, if you have a bank account, you want to make sure no one else is using your name and your identifiers to invade your bank account. The protection of your financial assets depends upon your ability to control your own identity and make sure somebody else doesn't have it. And finally, the ability to control your identity affects your reputation. Because if people can do bad things in your name will suffer for it. And therefore, you've got a keen interest on a personal level, and this relates to your personal privacy in being able to make sure that other people don't impersonate you.